The reality is, my friends, that Mark Carney and the Liberals are spending irresponsibly and threatening our present generation with high inflation and our future generations with more debt. In fact, it looks like this year's Liberal deficit might be even bigger than the one that Trudeau left behind.
Well, it looks like Canada is financially doomed. Folks, welcome back to the channel. I hope you're all doing well. Today we're going to be taking a look at a report that came out earlier this week that shows some pretty grim data. And this actually corroborates some opinion pieces that were written a few months ago on this topic. But now it's looking like there's potentially some actual data to show that these predictions are correct. But before we get started, if you guys could, please like, comment, and subscribe to the channel so we can kind of get these videos and this information out there for people to find out what's actually going on. Now, back in May, there was an opinion piece that was written in the Financial Post talking about the government's new budget framework. Essentially, Carney talking about how there's going to be an operational budget as well as a capital budget. And this is saying that Carney's accounting change reduces transparency and accountability. If borrowing is fine for spending that goes into the capital account, soon all spending will be categorized as capital. And the Fraser Institute actually commented on this article, saying that the government plans to separate federal spending into two budgets, the operating budget and the capital budget. First off, the change will make it more difficult to recognize the actual size of the deficit. While the Carney government plans to balance the operating budget by 2028-2029, this does not mean it plans to stop borrowing money. In fact, it will continue to borrow to finance increased capital spending, and as a result, after accounting for both operating and capital spending, this will increase the planned deficits over the next 4 years by a projected $93.4 billion compared to the Trudeau's government last spending plan, which we all know they blew right by their so-called $40 billion guardrail by reaching a $62 billion deficit. However, things are looking even worse now because a new report came out earlier this week on July 3rd from the Howe Institute titled "The Fiscal Update the Government Should Have Produced and the Budget Canada Needs." Now, before we get into this article, I'm going to play you a bit of what the mainstream media is reporting on this.
Well, the Howe Institute is calling on the Liberal government to make steeper cuts to program spending as it expects Canada's deficit to top $92 billion this fiscal year.
All right, so for more on this, let's bring in CTV's Jeremy Sharon, who is live in Ottawa. Good morning, Jeremy. So what do we know about the targeted defense spending?
Well, Courtney and Jen, what we know is that this new report from the Howe Institute, a think tank, a well-regarded think tank, shows just how much reaching some of these defense spending targets, NATO defense spending targets, would cost the federal government. This latest report from Howe indicates, as you've just touched on, that this fiscal year alone, reaching that 2% target of defense spending, 2% of GDP, would cost or will require the government to reach a deficit of $92 billion. Further to that, during the NATO summit last week, the federal government and Canada committed to a new target of 5% of GDP spending within the next decade. The Howe Institute estimates that by 2035, reaching that 5% target could mean that defense spending alone could add $68.4 billion to Canada's deficit. That is a significant amount of money. And as you've touched on, the Howe Institute is pushing the federal government to make further cuts, program spending cuts, and find ways to make up some of that money.
Now, I will be playing more of that video, but I do want to kind of come back into the report that was written and show you what they're talking about here. Because, again, these are all kind of estimates because there was no budget that was provided, as mentioned here, saying no budget, no plan. The federal government has said it will not release a budget until the fall. Delaying a budget until the fiscal year is more than half over is never good. But Canada's current high spending trajectory makes this delay especially bad. And as I mentioned earlier in the video, they had already been voted against in the House of Commons, saying that they wanted a budget tabled before they sat for the summer, but the Liberals didn't do it. Now, in this section of the Deteriorating Fiscal Outlook, they mentioned how kind of they calculated some of this. And so they said, we calculated a revised baseline fiscal projection by including policy initiatives that appear firm. either because of definitive statements such as the cancellation of the proposed changes to capital gains taxation and the June 2025 plans to first accelerate defense spending to 2% of GDP and then gradually increase it to 5% by 2035, which again we've heard Mark Carney talk about a few times. Now, as we scroll down, we're going to get down into this chart that they developed in terms of how much spending is actually going to happen. And they write, even in this optimistic scenario, the deficit would average $78 billion annually over the next 4 years, and the net debt to GDP ratio would remain stable around the elevated levels of 2025 to 2026. Excluding the speculative savings, the cumulative deficit would be almost $350 billion over 4 years, or an annual average of $86 billion, and the net debt to GDP ratio would increase to 44%. Further, the baseline deficit without any non-implemented initiatives in the electoral platform is still elevated to $66 billion a year. And so this is a chart that they created with all the estimates. And when we scroll down here, this number, the big number here, deficits including uncertain savings, and all of these numbers are in millions. This is $310 billion in the next 4 years, and they actually break it down here. So this is the $92 billion that they're talking about we're spending just this year alone, probably by the end of the year. And then each subsequent year, it's going to be in the $70 billion range.
Over the last 10 years, Liberals have created a morbidly obese government, and over the last 10 weeks, Mark Carney has added hundreds of billions of dollars of new spending promises to it.
Now, the report does talk about how a lot of this projections are based on estimates from what Carney has said in regards to the NATO 2% spending, as well as the 5% as mentioned. And down here it says, in Table 2, which we'll take a look at in a second, we present a hypothetical scenario where annual defense spending raises gradually from the 2% to the 5% over 10 years, with half of the spending allocated to depreciable capital assets. These amounts continue to grow over the 10-year period as the 5% target approaches and the stock of amortized capital outlays increases. By year 10, new defense commitments could add a staggering $68 billion to the deficit under this scenario. And the mainstream media does talk about this. Now, as you can see here, the baseline spend all the way up to 2035 gets up to $87.4 billion.
A separate report from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives looks at what it would cost to cut to the public service as much as the federal government promised to do so, or the Liberals promised to do so during the campaign. Mark Carney and the Liberals promised in 2026, 2027 to reduce the public services spending by $6 billion and then to further reduce it to $13 billion by 2028 to 2029. The promise was to do so through better efficiencies in the public service. The Canadian Centre for Public Alternatives says it would require 24% cut in public service spending to eventually reach that $13 billion cut. It will be very difficult, this report indicates, to do so without actually cutting the public service and some of the programs, rather than just doing so through efficiency. So these two reports from two separate institutions are providing a pretty unique outlook at what the federal government's finances could look like if we commit to that promise of reaching 5% of defense spending eventually, but also if if the federal government, if the Liberals do follow through on that promise to make significant spending cuts to the public service.
This is something that they covered in the report, saying that separating the operating and capital spending is unhelpful. The large deficit projected in this update cannot be downplayed or disguised by dividing the budget into two new categories, which is something that Carney has been going on and on about. Operating and capital, and targeting a balanced operating budget only as proposed in the election platform. And even after he became the prime minister, he was coming out with videos talking about this exact thing.
I will balance our operational budget in 3 years. We'll spend what we need to with the money we already have.
Just some more liberal mumbo jumbo, but as the report goes on to say, no firm details have been released about what each category will include, but logically, the operating budget will consist of whatever does not fall under the new capital category. The rationale for introducing a capital budget is unclear. Under public sector accounting standards, the federal government, like all Canadian governments, use accrual accounting. So its capital costs are amortized over the useful life of the assets. As a result, the government's statement of operations already shows costs related to capital investments. Depreciation, about $7 billion per year, a serious blow to transparency and accountability, which is what the whole article back in May was about. So again, this is giving more legs to that whole opinion piece. Now, this is the next section, which gets pretty interesting, where it says what Canada needs to do in the federal budget.
Okay, Jeremy, of course, the big question is how will all this spending impact our deficit?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, that is kind of the big question. How do you balance both out? And if you look at the numbers that we just outlined, even if you do manage to cut, $13 billion of public service spending, that is not enough to make up for the significant increase in defense spending that we are expecting to see. Again, we're looking at a number of $68.4 billion added to the deficit by 2035 for defense spending alone. The federal government is going to have to find further efficiencies, is going to have to make further cuts, or accept that they're going to be borrowing more money moving forward to reach these targets.
Now, as you heard from the report, the federal government could potentially find $13 billion in some programs if they decide to cut them, but it's nowhere close to what they actually need. And this report from CD Howe does lay out some options, which we're going to cover a little bit of. But it says the federal fiscal policy and promises do not support the transformation of Canada's trade relations or promote investment and overconsumption. This is something that even the Bank of Canada has been harping on for I don't know how many months now, about productivity being our detriment. And this goes on to say, adding $300 billion in federal debt while doing nothing to raise investment and ding, 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 productivity will make Canada more vulnerable, not less. For that reason, the next federal budget, which should come as soon as possible, should have the following features. Now, number one is dropping more costly platform initiatives. 2 was finding deeper savings from existing operating spending. But 3 and 4 is kind of where I wanted to take a look at. And it says, rely more on less damaging taxes. Canada's personal income tax rates are already high. The top rate is over 50% in most provinces. And our corporate income taxes are uncompetitive, undermining the investment we need to become more productive and raise workers' wages. Those rates should come down. If the federal government is determined to fund spending that requires higher revenues, the least damaging option is to raise the GST rate as proposed in the Institute's shadow budget. Now, as we move into 4 here, this is kind of a double-edged sword where it says cut federal transfers to provinces and territories. The proposed cuts to transfers that fund programs that are not in the federal government's jurisdiction, provinces and territories would not welcome such a move. Indeed, many might raise their own consumption taxes in response, but deficit-financed federal transfers are less consistent with fiscal sustainability and accountability than tax-financed ones. And the Canadian Federation will be healthier if the provinces and territories become more fiscally self-sufficient. And the reason I say this is double-edged because right now the federal government is kind of screwing us over, but if they start taking away some of that funding that they've been supplying to the provinces and territories, and then the provinces and territories raise their rates to then be self-sufficient, the taxpayer is again hit on the hook for all of this. So either way you look at it, we're screwed. But it goes on to say the need for clarity and these serious choices. It is widely accepted that Canada's economy is at a critical crossroads. So are Canada's public finances. Beyond the economic drag of high deficits and raising debt, it is unfair to pass these burdens onto the current, young, and future generations. And that's exactly what Pierre was talking about at the opener, how we are threatening our current and future people with all of this high debt that is currently accumulating and will be accumulating. And the last point of this report says, the federal government itself should release full economic and fiscal projections to enable a proper national debate. And this all ties back to the main opinion pieces, as I said in May, where it was talking about transparency and accountability. Our government does not have any of that in its purview. It keeps just doing whatever it feels like doing, and it is royally screwing us Canadians. Now, I don't want to end on just doom and gloom, so I'm going to leave you with a clip from Pierre Poilievre at that whole press conference roasting Mark Carney. But as always, let me know what you guys think about all this in the comment section below. Leave your thoughts. Again, if you can, hit the subscribe button. And as always, I will catch you guys on the next one. Thanks so much.
They love you, Danielle, and I know that you're a very hospitable person at Stampede time, even for Liberals. We have to be hospitable. And so let me start in a spirit of nonpartisanship as a Calgarian to welcome Prime Minister Mark Carney to his very first Stampede in this role. And he had, of course, to do the customary thing and flip some pancakes. Now, he thought he would be great at it because in his trade talks with Trump, he's had so much experience flip-flopping. But still, it didn't go as planned. One of the pancakes got broken in half and the other one splattered everywhere. And he owned up to it, but a careful review of a slow motion replay demonstrated exactly what the problem was. He couldn't figure out whether to put his elbows up or down. So